First Peter, this great letter, and we're in First Peter chapter 3 again, the passage that was just read. It's kind of the practical part of the letter. Peter again is addressing people who are suffering for their faith and really suffering for all kinds of reasons, just like many of us are suffering, are struggling. We've got problems in life in every sphere, maybe relationally, maybe financially, maybe family-wise, maybe in our jobs. We're struggling. We have hardships and challenges just like they did. This is nothing new. Whether you're a believer or an unbeliever, we will suffer in this life. And this is what Peter is talking about. This is the people that he's addressing, people just like us, people who need hope, people who need encouragement. And that's exactly what Peter gives. And it's what we need today as well. And, Peter, we've just finished this section in these last 3 Sundays where Peter was talking about specific situations where we struggle, where people struggled back then, where people still struggle even today, dealing with a difficult government, dealing with a difficult boss, struggling in a difficult marriage. We talked about that last Sunday. Now, in these next 3 Sundays, starting this morning, Peter is addressing suffering, but more in a general sense, okay? 3 different aspects of suffering that he's going to talk about this morning, and in the next 2 Sundays we'll be looking at as well. Today he's going to be talking about suffering for doing good. Suffering for doing good. That's kind of the topic for this morning. So 3 points just to begin with here that Peter gives us in this section that was just read for us. Number 1, we should be eager to do good. We should be eager to do good. As Christians, as followers of Jesus, as believers in the Lord Jesus Christ, we should be eager to do good. You see this in verse 10, 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 10. He quotes from a psalm here. It says, "For whoever would love life and see good days must keep their tongue from evil and their lips from deceitful speech. They must turn from evil and do good. They must seek peace and pursue it." And you look at verse 13, who is going to harm you if you are eager to do good? Eager to do good. And this has come up actually several times, and it kind of surprised me, how many times this comes up in the letter of 1 Peter. We talked about it before. We, as followers of Christ, should be people who are doing good. Should be eager to do good. People should see us. And the word he uses again and again in this letter is good. Do good. Be good. It's a very general kind of word in many ways. But that's what should describe us. And thankfully, he does get into a little bit more detail. If you go to the first verse here in this section, verse 8, it says, "Finally, all of you, what does this goodness look like? Be like-minded. Be sympathetic. Love one another. Be compassionate and humble." 5 things he just gives, right? Just like rapid fire here in this verse. Like-minded, sympathetic, loving one another, compassionate, humble. Like-minded, sympathetic, loving, compassionate, and humble. And one way to say this, and we've said this in the last few weeks also, is that people who know you should see you as this person who is maybe the most unifying, the most sympathetic, the most loving, the most compassionate, the most humble person that they may have ever met in their lives. When we join this office or this new organization, this company, when we move onto the street or into this tower, the way I was thinking about it, it should be like, literally, it should be like Jesus just moved down the street from us. Jesus just joined my team at the office. Can you believe that? Jesus just moved into my same tower. That's the impact it should have. This is like Jesus has just come. The hands, the feet, the light, the beauty, the presence of Jesus is now here. That's an amazing challenge for us. Wait, what? Is this you? Is this you? In whatever situation where you live, where you work, among your extended family, among your friends, do they see you as this person who is so good? Loving, compassionate, sympathetic, humble, unifying, peace-loving? Is that you? Or are you just kind of surviving? You're just kind of getting by day to day, or just trying to, just be happy, just trying to make it another day, trying to keep your children on the right path, and all that stuff is obviously okay and it's good, but are we eager to do good in every situation? And do people see us as that kind of person? Okay, first thing that Peter reminds us of, again, we are people that are eager to do good as followers of Christ. But then the second thing that he also reminds us is that we should expect to suffer. Good people, even good people, will suffer. That's a sad truth. And you look at verse 13, it says, "Who is going to harm you if you're eager to do good?" And that's a good point. That's how you would think logically. If I'm here to do good, to love, to be compassionate, sympathetic, humble, to bring peace in this place, and to be a light, and to be righteous, to do good, to be a good person, why would I suffer? And yet, that's a question he asks. But then right after that, he talks about the fact that we are going to suffer. If you look at verse 14, "But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed." And if you skip down to verse 16, "Keeping a clear conscience, so that those who speak maliciously against your good behavior in Christ may be ashamed of their slander, for it is better, if it is God's will, to suffer for doing good than for doing evil." And right after that, as we'll see, he gives the example of Jesus, who suffered for doing good. Even good people will suffer. And this is something we need to just get into our minds, get into our hearts. We should expect to suffer. Even good people will suffer, and maybe instead of saying even good people will suffer, maybe I should say especially good people will suffer. Right? And again, if you just think, goodness incarnate came to this earth. Right? The best person of all. What did they do to him? What did they do to the best person of all? They couldn't stand him. They nailed him to a piece of wood. They just could not tolerate that kind of goodness and love and righteousness and humility. They hated him. They had to kind of remove him, annihilate him, destroy him. And it's going to be the same for us, isn't it? Good people, even good people, especially good people, should expect to suffer. And I was just thinking about this. How does this work? Why would good people suffer? And I just started thinking of all these different kinds of examples that were coming to my mind of how we suffer even when we're good, or especially when we're good. We suffer professionally. And I was thinking of my friend Stephen many years ago. He was working for a credit card company, and he was expected to lie. They trained him to lie, and he said, "I'm not going to lie. I'm not going to do that." And what was the result of that commitment not to lie? I'd love to say that even though he made this commitment, and because he made this commitment, God blessed him, and he was the number one, and he was the best, and that wasn't the fact. Month after month after month after month, as long as he was in this job, he would come last. Or sometimes he would get second last in his team. Right? You basically couldn't compete if you weren't willing to lie in that particular company, in that industry, in that particular position at least. He suffered, and it was embarrassing. And it was even financially painful. He never got the bonuses that his colleagues were getting, but this is the way it is, right? When you commit yourself, you're not going to do this sin against God, against these people that are listening to me and presumably trusting what I'm saying. I'm not going to lie to them. You're going to suffer professionally. You're going to suffer relationally. When you think of our young people, our school children, our teens, our college students, if you commit to being this good person, to being good, to being humble, to being loving and kind and compassionate, doing the right thing always, is that going to make you popular? I doubt it. Right? You're going to be a dork. You're going to be a dweeb. You're going to be a loser, or whatever, the words are nowadays that kids use for goody-goodies. And people like that. Right? You're not going to be popular. You're going to suffer relationally if you choose to do good, to be good. I was thinking of people, young people in our church who have said, I'm going to only marry, these single people, only going to marry a believer. Right? I'm going to make this commitment. I think this is right. I think this is what God wants for me. And I'm going to make this decision, and it's hard. Right? Whatever happens, I'm going to do this for God. I want to put God first in my marriage. Right? That's hard. You're going to suffer. People make comments and all these kinds of things. I've seen this again and again and again. Good people trying to do the right thing, and they suffer for it. When you be a good person, people are jealous of you. In fact, I just thought of that, and the first thing that came to my mind in these last few days as I was thinking of people being jealous of good people, my mind went back, you wouldn't believe this, 35 years or so, maybe more, to the time when I was in 5th class. This is an embarrassing story. Okay, there was this girl in my 5th grade class. Her name was Sarah, and she was pretty much perfect in every way. She was intelligent, she was athletic, she was beautiful, she was, just a teacher's pet. And maybe, this is in class 5. If it would have been maybe class 8 or 9 or something, then we would all have been in love with her. Right? But we were just 9 or 10 years old, so we hated her. This girl who's so good. She's smarter than us, that maybe she even runs faster than us in the races. And she's more beloved, and she's getting better marks than us. And I remember me and my friend, we were in the classroom once, and there was nobody there. I can't remember if it was early or late or whatever it was. And we were in the classroom. We had these big desks, and they were really big and fat, and you opened them, and all your stuff was inside. And we went to Sarah's desk, and we just opened it and saw her, this homework sheet that she was supposed to hand in. And we just scribbled all over it. And then, the class started, or whatever it was, I can't remember. And, she opened the desk and to give the sheet, and she was horrified. And the teacher started scolding her. And she was crying, and it's so vivid, 35 years later. It's so vivid. And we were just, slinking down in our seats, and, I felt so bad. And even just this week, I was thinking, why did I do that? And I couldn't think of any other reason except jealousy. That this kid was smarter than us, more athletic than us maybe, or, all those kinds of things. And that to a girl, I can't tolerate it. Just out of sheer jealousy. Went to her desk and scribbled on her paper, this is the way it is. You you decide to be a good person, you're going to suffer. It's actually going to make your life harder, not easier. This is how it is when you decide to be good, when you're eager to do good. Some people appreciate it. Many people don't appreciate it. In fact, another thing I was thinking about was, when you're a good person, then you will get taken advantage of. If you're a good person, you're generous and you're kind, you're sacrificial, you will be taken advantage of. And people will look at you and say, you're so naive and you're so stupid. Don't you know how life works? And as I was thinking about this, I realized, there's one way that that's very easy. If you don't want to ever be taken advantage of, it's actually very simple. You know what you do? You be exacting and miserly, and you're kind of isolated, and you don't think about anybody else, and you don't do anything for anybody else, and you'll never get taken advantage of. Isn't that great? Isn't that great? Well, that's terrible, right? You decide to be a generous person, a kind person, a sacrificial person, someone who serves others, you will absolutely be taken advantage of at some point or another. Doesn't matter how wise or how, whatever you try to be, you will be taken advantage of. But that's part of being good and doing good, and that's what we see. That's what we've all experienced, isn't it? These are the things that happen to good people. We should expect to suffer. Just like Jesus suffered. Even though he was the best, the most humble, the most kind, the most compassionate person who ever lived. And of course, if you decide to be a good person, you're going to make sacrifices. If you decide to be generous, you're going to have less for yourself and for your family. If you're really actually generous. Right? That's just part of it, obviously. Right? If you give to others, you have less for yourself. If you decide to serve or say volunteer in the church and sacrifice for others in our church family, you're going to have less me time and less downtime and less family time probably and less relaxation time. And life is going to get busier and it's going to get more complicated and you're going to have to maybe wake up early sometimes or stay late sometimes. Or do all these extra things for other people, but that's part of doing good, and it's hard, and we suffer. And then on top of that, people take advantage, like we talked about, or people don't appreciate it, or they betray us, like Judas betrayed Jesus. Right? But that all comes as part of the territory of doing good. So we should be eager to do good. At the same time, we should expect to suffer. And the last thing, maybe the hardest thing, we must never take revenge. We must never take revenge. We're doing good. People are not appreciating it. In fact, they're even taking advantage of it. Right? They're taking our help and using it for themselves and even hurting us in return, and you could probably think of all kinds of examples in all these kinds of categories. And yet, look at what Peter says here, verse 9. Do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. And this is the most natural thing in the world. I've been hurt. Someone has done evil. That's the word he uses, isn't it? Do not repay evil with evil. Evil has been done to me. Someone has insulted me. This hurts. It's embarrassing. It's wrong. This is untrue. I'm offended. And the most natural thing in the world is to take revenge. That's what everybody would expect you to do. In fact, people would advise you and counsel you to do that. Right? This is how you can kind of get back at them. Or many of us, perhaps, even if we wouldn't get back at them, literally, right? At least in our minds, we plot. Ooh, if I can just be in that position again, this is what I would say. Oh, that would silence them. Later, just cut them into the heart. And yet, again, verse 9, do not repay evil with evil or insult with insult. On the contrary, now get this. End of verse 9. Repay evil with what? With what? Blessing. Repay evil with blessing? Because to this you were called so that you may inherit a blessing. Don't repay evil with evil, insult with insult. Repay evil, insults, betrayal, mockery, taking advantage of, all those terrible things that we have to suffer. Repay them with blessing. And did you see at the end of verse 9? Because this to you are called so that you may inherit a blessing. You may inherit a blessing. You want to inherit a blessing, and I think it's talking about heaven. You want to go to heaven. You want to be blessed forever and ever and ever. This is what those kinds of people do. They don't repay evil for evil or insult for insult. They receive evil and they pay it back with a blessing. Oh. Wow. Repay evil with blessing. Repay evil with blessing. That means I love you. Even though you've done this terrible thing to me, you've hurt me, it's caused pain, it's maybe even caused a change of trajectory in my entire life, and it makes me so angry. I'm not going to repay this evil with evil. Even though you've insulted me, I'm not going to just insult you back or get back at you. I want to see you blessed. Oh man, that is not natural. That is supernatural, isn't it? That requires the Holy Spirit working in a person's life. That requires a deep understanding of the gospel in your heart, what Jesus has done for you. Right? Even if you're going to begin to bless a person that's hurt you, it starts with forgiveness, doesn't it? You can't even begin to bless a person that you hate, that you're bitter against, that you want to get back at. Right? It starts with forgiveness. And that only happens when I understand how much Jesus has forgiven me, right? And when that's gone deep inside my heart. And now, instead of getting back at you, what is forgiveness? It means I'm absorbing. It doesn't mean saying that, no, it's okay, you didn't do anything, it's fine, whatever, forget about it. No, that's not forgiveness. Forgiveness, we've talked about this many, many times, right? Forgiveness means acknowledging the pain, the hurt, the loss, and everything else that you have caused me, intentionally or unintentionally, maybe maliciously, maybe out of jealousy or whatever. You have hurt me deeply. And now, as an act of forgiveness, because of what Jesus has done for me, I choose to absorb that into myself. I'm absorbing it into myself and not taking it out on you, or not even holding that bitterness inside of me. Right? I'm releasing you, and as I do that, I'm also releasing myself, isn't it? I forsake revenge. Oh, that is so powerful, especially when people have caused you to suffer, especially when they've caused you to suffer because of good. And yet I decide to forgive, to love, and to bless. Jesus said, pray for your enemies. That's certainly part of it. Right? I'm not going to hate them anymore. I'm going to pray for them. I'm going to see eagerly how they can move forward in life and do well in life, right? Despite what they've done to me. Wow, that's so powerful. That's so radical. That's so world-changing. And this is exactly what God has called us to do as believers. It's not mainly, standing up and preaching big sermons or this and that. It's just these simple things in life, which we all go through in our workplaces, in our families, among our friends. Right? We're constantly being hurt. We're constantly suffering. We're trying to be good, and we're trying to do the right thing, and people are hurting us and causing us pain. And instead of taking it out and getting back at that person, I forgive, I pray, I love, I encourage, I seek to bless. That is what Christians do. This is what it means to be a follower of Jesus. And by the way, let me just add here really quickly that when I say I want to forgive and I want this person to be blessed, it doesn't mean that I don't care about justice. Justice is still a real thing, and justice is still important. Right? God cares about justice. The society, it's important that we have justice. Right? In fact, this last week, we just started this podcast, and this is through Delhi School of Theology, which I'm involved in, and I was hosting this podcast. It'll come out at some time, and I'll let you know when it comes out. But this last one that we did this week was on the imprecatory Psalms. You know what those are? Imprecatory Psalms, those Psalms where David or the psalmist, basically asks for judgment on his enemy. You know those kinds of Psalms? And the one that we were talking about specifically in this podcast, Psalm 137, where this person says, "Happy are the ones who take your babies and dash them against the rocks." Have you come across that verse? Psalm 137, verse 9. And we had this expert. Thankfully, it wasn't me answering that question of what in the world does that mean? Is this right? Is this good? And is this holy? Should we pray like this? It's in the Psalms. And some of those details, of course, are pretty gory and quite difficult to handle. And what does that really mean? And so on. But as this person was saying, who we're interviewing on this podcast, the psalmist, in that verse and in verses like that in the Psalms, basically asking for justice. And they're not taking justice or they're not taking revenge, but they're asking God to be just and to do the justice that God has promised to do to those who do evil and wicked. Right? And sometimes it can be a really fine line between wanting justice, right, and asking God to do just, but taking revenge. I'm not asking for justice so this person will be hurt. That's not what's happening. I'm asking for justice because it's right. And so that others maybe won't be hurt in the same way by the same person. Right? But from my side, especially inside, I want to bless. I want to repay evil with blessing. I'm praying for them. I've forgiven them already. And now, in fact, I'm asking God to bless. I want to see them go on. Of course, I want to see them change and improve, but I want to see them ultimately prosper under God. Wow. I want to share one amazing example of this, just really quickly. I've been reading these missionary stories with my kids in the last few months, actually, and I don't know how much they're appreciating them, but I love these stories. They're just so amazing. And the one that we read this week was a guy named Nate Saint. Has anybody ever heard of Nate Saint? Just raise your hand if that name sounds familiar. Has anybody heard of Nate Saint? Not a single person. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, that's good. So you'll learn about Nate Saint now, okay? He was born in 1923. You just think about that. 1923, almost 100 years ago. And he was a pilot. Airplanes had just been invented. Okay, so airplanes were a brand new thing at that time when Nate Saint was born. He's an American. Nate was interested in planes from an early age. Eventually, he became a believer. Eventually, he learned how planes can be used to get the gospel of Jesus out to people who lived in places that were remote. Okay, places that were otherwise inaccessible. Okay, planes could be used. He's become this believer, and he wants to see other people become believers, and he realizes there's a way that I can combine my love for planes and the fact that I'm a pilot with getting the gospel out to people who've never heard. Okay, so he becomes a missionary pilot, 1955 now. Okay, so about 70 years ago. And he's about 32 years old now, 1955. He gets connected with Jim Elliot, you might have heard that name before, and 4 other young men, young missionaries, who are dreaming about sharing about Jesus with the Auca tribe in Ecuador. And the Aucas in Ecuador, interestingly, we had Sakshi Verma, I think last week or 2 weeks ago here, and she was talking. She's a missionary in Ecuador, same place. Okay, but there was a tribe there 70 years ago named the Aucas. Savage against anyone outside of their tribe is because they believed that everybody else around them and anybody who wasn't part of their tribe was cannibals. Interesting. They weren't cannibals. They believed everybody else was cannibals. That was sort of the rumor that was going around. So they didn't allow any contact with anybody outside of their tribe, and they were known to kill anybody who tried to contact them. And so these young men, so there's 5 of them, including Nate, they do a lot of research. They learn as much as they can about this tribe, their language. Eventually, the time came, they start making contact with the tribe. But the men, they knew that they just couldn't walk in there and start, hello, how are you, and so on. They would be killed, just like many who had been killed before them who had tried to make contact with the tribe. So for several months, this is what they do. They lower down baskets filled with gifts. So take a basket, fill it with gifts that they thought that the tribespeople would appreciate. And Nate, who was the pilot, he devised this system where he would go in a tight circle and the basket would stay in place. Okay? The people would come and take the gifts, and they do this for months, and eventually they not only take the gifts, but they even start putting in their own gifts. And when they lift up the basket, they get some little gifts, little bits of food and little tools and stuff that the tribespeople were making. Okay? And so after doing this for many months, they finally decided, January 1956, the time had come to actually go down there and make contact face-to-face with the tribespeople. And Nate realized there was a beach about 6 kilometers away from the main tribal village where he felt they could land their plane. And so that's what they did. They landed there, and they camped out there on the beach, about 6 kilometers from that tribal village. Okay, so they're there. After 3 days, a man and 2 women came from the tribe and made contact with them. Okay, and this is the picture that we have. This is Nate Saint. This is that after 3 days of camping, after months, and in fact, months of research and trying to learn the language and giving these gifts through the plane and all that, they finally land. 3 days later, this person comes. This is a tribal guy from the Auca tribe. Okay, and it seems like it's friendly. It's gone really, really well. They're so happy. They're so thankful. Okay, then nothing happens for another 2 days. And 2 days later, 10 men show up, but this time with spears in their hands. And these men, the 5 of them, they're all young. I think all of them, or most of them, were in their early 30s, including Nate. And they're all married, and their wives knew that something was wrong when they didn't radio in at 4:30 that evening, as they had planned and as they were doing every day. And very soon after this, the bodies of the 5 men were found floating in the river. Okay, Nate, 4 young, very bright, amazingly godly men, bodies floating in the river. That was it. Okay. Now, just a few things I want to note here from this story. First of all, I found out, as I did a little bit more research on this, that the men had actually brought guns with them. They had actually brought guns. And they said maybe, this could be used as a way of fending off anybody. Maybe they wanted to kill animals. I don't know. Right? But they had brought guns, but they had made a decision and a commitment beforehand. They weren't going to kill any person. They wouldn't use the guns in self-defense in that way against the men. Right? They had guns. They allowed themselves to be speared to death instead of using the guns. Okay, that's the first thing I want you to note. Second thing is that Rachel Saint, that's Nate's sister, and Elizabeth Elliot, that's Jim Elliott's wife, they decide that this work that's begun amongst the tribe, they don't want it to end like this. And we're going to keep trying. And so they went back. And others also went back to the same tribe. And I'm going to show you an amazing picture right here. This is Steve Saint. This is Nate Saint's son, who's now obviously grown up. And you know those 4 tribal people that are with him, those are 4 of the 10 who had killed his father. Can you believe that? Those are 4 of the 10 tribes people that killed his father, that speared his father to death, along with those 4 other men. And this was the result of what happened. You know, basically the whole tribe became Christian. They also became pastors, and they established churches and Bible colleges, and they started reaching out to the other tribes around them. In fact, I've got one more picture here. This is Steve Saint again. Besides, this is a tribal person named Minkaye, who was the one who put the spear in his dad. And now he's preaching, right? Presumably in America or something like that. Right? This is what they did after this. All these men and women, the whole tribe became believers in Jesus. And in fact, this man, Minkaye, the one who put the spear into Nate Saint, is the one who baptized Steve Saint, the son here. And not only that, one last thing on this, you know, the heroic sacrifice of these men, it became well known in the months that followed, including a cover story on Time magazine. It was covered by Reader's Digest and all these different magazines at that time, in the 1950s. And in the years afterwards, they realized and found that the number of young people signing up to be overseas missionaries, especially in difficult places, had quadrupled. So the number of people that went out to spread the gospel and to be like them, maybe martyrs for their faith, quadrupled. All these people signed up to go. And the fruit, you could say, of those 5 people that gave their lives, and in many ways, you know, as I was thinking about this, I realized it's not just their story of sacrifice, and they're not just the only heroes here, right? It's also Nate Saint's wife and his sister, and Jim Elliott's wife, Elizabeth, right, who didn't decide to take revenge or just throw in the towel and go home and say, this is not, you know, let's do something different. They went back and they went back and they went back. And years later, not only this whole tribe came to know Christ, but thousands and thousands, not only in Ecuador, in that region, but all around the world, because all these other missionaries that were inspired to go. You know, as I was thinking about this passage and I was reading this story with my kids, I was like, this is how forgiveness works. This is what it means to repay evil, not with evil or insult with insult, but repay evil with blessing and with perseverance and with love and compassion and humility. Wow, how do you do this? Where does this come from? Let me just very quickly, as we wrap up this morning, how do we become this kind of radical, supernaturally loving, forgiving, blessing people after we've suffered so deeply? How do we forgive and actually desire, pray for, work for the blessing of that very person who hurt us so deeply? How does that happen? Well, thankfully, Peter tells us. Let me just really quickly, first of all, remember God's blessing. Verse 14, but even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. You are blessed. Right? God sees this. God sees this betrayal. Right? That person may never see it. The judge may never see it. Right? Your family may never see it. God sees it. And God will bless. Right? Remember God's blessing. Secondly, don't be afraid. If you just go on in verse 14. But even if you should suffer for what is right, you are blessed. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. And I was just thinking, you know, what an apt statement. So often, the reason that we take revenge and we harbor so much hatred in our hearts is because of fear. Fear of this happening again to us, right? Maybe by the same person, maybe by other people. Fear of failure, fear of mockery, fear of rejection. Fear that my life is over. Fear that I'll never recover from this. Fear that my reputation is gone. Right? All these fears that come in suddenly, right? And the only way I see out is to take revenge on that person that did this to me. Jesus, don't fear. Don't be afraid. Right? Don't let fear allow you to control your response in this case. Right? Don't be controlled by fear. Don't be afraid. Don't fear their threats. Don't be frightened. Instead, make Jesus your master. You see this in verse 15? Again, at the end of verse 14. Do not fear their threats. Do not be frightened. But, verse 15, in your hearts revere Christ as Lord. And I've read this verse so many times, but it got new meaning when I actually studied the context of it. Right? You're suffering for good. Don't be afraid. Instead, make Jesus your Lord. Make Jesus your master. Make Jesus your king. Live for Jesus' glory. Make your ambition Jesus' praise. Make your desire Jesus' pleasure. Make your longing to do Jesus' will. Make your obsession Jesus. Be obsessed with Jesus. Do not be obsessed with what's happened or this person or what they did to you or how it's ruined your life and how angry you are and what you can do back to them. Don't do that. Don't fear. Make Jesus your Lord. Revere Jesus as Lord. Make Jesus your master. Be obsessed with Jesus. Focus on Jesus. That's what Peter says. Next thing, seek the salvation of the lost, of that person. Right? See this in verse 15 again? But in your hearts, revere Christ as Lord. Always be prepared to give an answer to everyone who asks you to give the reason for the hope that you have. I don't know if that verse sounds familiar to you. This verse is used very often, especially in the context of apologetics. You know that word? Giving a defense for the faith, Ravi Zacharias and that kind of stuff. Right? Be ready to give a defense. Be ready to give a reason why you believe. But, the context of this is not some intellectual debate or argument. The context is you've been hurt for doing good. You're suffering. And yet you're at peace, you're not afraid, you're still strong, you're still standing, and now people are asking, where do you get this peace? Where do you get this hope? Right? If I had faced half of this, I would just be gone. I'd be depressed. I'd be, I've committed suicide. How do you still wake up in the morning? How do you put one foot in front of the next? How do you keep going? And now I've got a reason. Be prepared. And it says here at the end of verse 15, do this with gentleness and respect. Not accusatory, not with arrogance and pride and lots of intellectual arguments, right? With humility, with gentleness, respect, because I want to see people getting saved. And finally, last thing, look at Jesus' example. Verse 17, for it is better if it's God's will to suffer for doing good than for doing evil. For Christ also suffered once for sins, the righteous for the unrighteous, to bring you to God. He was put to death in the body, but made alive in the spirit. And look at Jesus. Focus on Jesus. Remember, Jesus also suffered. You are walking in the long line of Jesus and prophets and godly, righteous men and women of old who suffered for this exact same thing, for doing good, for being righteous, for doing the right thing. You're walking in Jesus' footsteps. Don't forget that. Jesus is pleased. People are being impacted. Don't be afraid. Don't give in to fear. Focus on Jesus. And I really believe, if we don't give in to fear, we focus on Christ, we focus on the lost at all times. Whatever has happened, as hurt as I am, as much as I'm suffering and in pain, right? but it's not really ultimately about me. It's not about me. It's not a, some things are going to be different now, and it hurts. The future is going to be different. My family has lost something, whatever it might be. But it's at the end of the day, it's not about me. If I focus on Jesus, I focus on how my response to this will affect the lost people around me, people who are watching, especially this person that did it to me. Remember that God is blessing me through this. I can make it. I can really make it. I can do this. I can continue to be eager to do good, even in the midst of suffering, just like Jesus did and as Jesus has called us to do. Why don't we bow our heads and close our eyes? We're going to go to the communion table now, in a moment, to remember specifically this very thing. The most righteous man who ever lived, the best, the most good person who ever walked the face of this earth. They didn't love him. They didn't applaud him. They shouted, "Crucify him." They whipped him and beat him, mocked him, spat on his face. And as we remember his sacrifice, his body that was broken, his blood that was shed, we're also being reminded that if God gives us the privilege to, like Jesus, to suffer for doing good, we are blessed. We are blessed. Let's just take a moment as we ponder these things, the pain, the hurt, suffering in our own lives, the people that have done these things to us and maybe continuing to do these things to us. How are we going to choose to respond? And as we think about that for our own lives, let's also, again, prepare our hearts to take communion this morning and remember Jesus is suffering for us. Let's just take a minute.